Okay, we're in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verses 23 through 40. First question, what is happening in this passage? This passage says in verse 23, these are the numbers of the bands that were ready armed to the war, and they came to Hebron to turn the kingdom of Saul to him, that's to David, according to the word of the Lord. And Saul has recently died here, and now the kingdom would likely pass, the normal route would be it would pass from the father to the son. Saul had some sons that died in the same battle with him, but also Ishbosheth, his son, was still alive. But rather than turn the kingdom over to Ishbosheth, we see here the people are turning the king over to David, and it says, according to the word of the Lord. The second question, what did the descendants of Issachar understand? That's in verse 32. It says, the children of Issachar, which were men that had understanding of the times. They understood the times. Next question, what do you think this means? What does it mean that they had understanding of the times? Now, we can't say dogmatically what it meant, but likely they understood the time in which they were living. They understood that right now is the time that David is to receive the kingdom that God had promised him many years ago. Of course, you remember the story of Samuel anointing David with oil and saying, you will be king over Israel. But at that time, he did not receive the kingdom. It wasn't the time yet for him to receive the kingdom. But then even throughout David's life, he had two opportunities to kill Saul. But David understood that it was not the time yet for him to become the king. And then even after that, there could be different points within the history of David and Saul's reign and David's life where we could say, maybe this is the time. Or even someone could say that now, yes, Saul has died, but still let the kingdom go to his son. And then after his son has reigned, and then maybe that would be the time later. But somehow the children of Issachar understood the times. They understood that now is the time for David to be made king. And the next question, because of this understanding, what did they know? It says they knew to know what Israel ought to do. They understood the time was time for David to be made king over all Israel, and they knew that this was what we needed to do now. They didn't take it by force when Saul was still living. They didn't have David take it by force. David knew it was not the time yet. It wasn't time for him to take the kingdom by force by killing Saul. They knew also that it wasn't a later time. It wasn't something, well, let's wait and see what God's will is before we decide if it's time for David to be king. It says the men of Issachar understood the times, and because of that, they knew what Israel ought to do. And then that last question, how can we apply this to our similar understanding? In many different ways, we may be able to discern the times. Jesus he uses this phrase, the signs of the times, talking about his messiahship, and was rebuking the Pharisees for not being able to read and discern the signs of the times. But there's two things we have here that the men of Issachar understood. They understood the times, but they also understood what they ought to do as a result of it. And this is something I've seen in my own Christian experience and seen with other Christians, that sometimes we have an understanding of the times. Yes, we can discern based on the biblical information, based on the current events that we see. We know the times are here. We understand that Jesus' coming is soon. We understand the things that are happening in the world that talk about the signs, that are the signs of the times. But do we, like the men of Issachar, understand and know what Israel ought to do? What should the people of God, what should I as a Christian be doing as a result of that? Well, that's on the big scale, but even on the individual scale, we can look at people's lives, and we have relatives, neighbors, friends, co-workers. We have people in our lives, and we can maybe understand the times. We can look and see God is doing something in their life. God has been preparing them to have a favorable response to his message of Jesus' love for them. Do we know then what we ought to do, what Israel ought to do? What should I do in response to this, to work with God to that end? We can summarize this understanding with two phrases. You could say they understood God's goal and they understood their role. We ourselves also, we can search and understand what is God's goal. We can understand the times. What is God trying to do in a certain circumstance? What is God trying to do in this individual's life? We're talking to someone. They're looking to us for counsel, looking to us for advice. Well, what is it? Can I discern from my understanding of the scriptures? Can I understand from my seeking and praying for God to give me enlightenment and understanding? Can I discern what God's goal is for them in this circumstance? And then secondly, can I understand what is my role, if any, in accomplishing that goal? Sometimes God has us to be passive and not actually do anything. But there are many times when God calls us to act. God calls us to fulfill a role in the accomplishment of his goal. One wonderful example of this is in the New Testament in Acts. When Paul and Silas are in prison, they're chained down, and then it says an earthquake takes place. And then after the earthquake, their chains fall off. The prison doors are open. They're free to leave. But rather than just rush to what their natural inclination would be, they first stopped. They thought, what is God's goal in this? The natural response, my response, would likely be, oh, well, God's goal in this is for me to be free. God's my God. He loves me. He wants me to be free. He wants me to be out of prison. But they discerned that God's goal in this earthquake was for the salvation of the jailer and of his family. And then they discerned, what is my role? What is our role in this? Our role is to preach the gospel to this man, and he and his family were saved as a result. This is the same thing that takes place in the Christian life today, that God's goal is the first thing we must be seeking. What is God's goal in the place he has me living? What is God's goal in the place he has me working? What is God's goal in the friends that he has me surrounded with, the relationships I've built over years? What is God's goal in that? And what is my role in glorifying his name and bringing others to the knowledge of his love for them and how they can be saved in Jesus? And like the men of Issachar, hopefully we can have this understanding and knowledge of what we ought to do.